Mecca, says Burckhardt, may be called a pretty town. As a rule, the streets are wider than in most eastern cities. The houses are lofty and built of stone, and its numerous windows opening upon the street give it a more cheerful and European aspect than the cities of Egypt or Syria, whose dwellings generally have few windows on the outside. Every house has a terrace built of stone, and sloping in such a way as to allow water to run down the gutters into the street. Low walls with parapets conceal these terraces, for as everywhere else in the East it is not thought right for a man to appear there. He would be accused of spying upon the women, who spend much of their time upon the terrace of the house, engaged in domestic work, drying corn, hanging out linen, and see. The only public place in the city is the large court of the Grand Mosque. Trees are rare, not a garden enlivens the view, and the scene depends for animation upon the well-stocked shops which abound during the pilgrimage, with the exception of 4 or 5 large houses belonging to the administration, 2 colleges, which have since been converted into warehouses for corn, and the mosque with the few buildings and colleges connected with it. Mecca can boast of no public buildings, and cannot compete in this respect with other cities in the east of the same size. The streets are unpaved, and as drains are unknown, water collects in puddles, and the accumulation of mud is inconceivable. For a water supply the natives trust to heaven, catching the rain in cisterns, for that obtained from the wells is so foul that it is impossible to drink it. In the centre of the town, where the valley widens a little, the mosque known as Bethala or El Haram is situated. This edifice owes its fame to the Kaaba which is enclosed in it, for other eastern towns can boast of mosques equally large and more beautiful. El Haram is situated in an oblong space, surrounded on the eastern side by a quadruple colonnade, and by a triple one on the other. The columns are connected by pointed arches. Upon each 4 stand little domes constructed of mortar and whitened outside. Some of these columns are of white marble, granite, or porphyry, but the greater part are of the common stone found among the mountains of Mecca. The Kaaba has been so often ruined and restored that no trace of a remote antiquity remains. It was in existence before this mosque was built. The traveller says, the Kaaba is placed upon an inclined base some 2 feet high, and its roof being flat, it presents the appearance at a little distance of a perfect cube. The only door by which it can be entered, and which is opened 2 or 3 times a year, is on the north side, about 7 feet above the ground, for which reason one cannot enter except by means of a wooden staircase. The famous black stone is enshrined at the northeastern corner of the Kaaba, near the door, and forms one of the angles of the building 4 or 5 feet above the floor of the court. It is difficult to ascertain the exact nature of this stone, as its surface has been completely worn and reduced to its present condition by the kisses and worshipping touches bestowed upon it by countless millions of pilgrims. The Kaaba is entirely covered with black silk, which envelopes its sides, leaving the roof exposed. This veil or curtain is called the keswa, and is renewed yearly during the pilgrimage. It is brought from Cairo, where it is manufactured at the expense of the viceroy. Up to the time of Burckhardt, no such detailed account of Mecca and her sanctuary had been given to the world. For this reason we shall insert extracts from the original narrative, extracts which might indeed be multiplied, for they include circumstantial accounts of the sacred well, called Zemzem, water from which is considered as an infallible remedy for every complaint. The traveller speaks also of the Gate of Salvation, of the Maqam Ibrahim, a monument containing the stone upon which Abraham sat when he was engaged in building the Kaaba, and where the marks of his knees may still be seen, and of all the buildings enclosed within the temple precincts. Judging from Burckhardt's minute and complete description, these spots still retain their former physiognomy. The same number of pilgrims chant the same songs, the men only are no longer the same. His accounts of the feast of the pilgrimage and the holy enthusiasm of the faithful are followed by a picture which brings before us, in the most sombre colours, the effects of this great gathering of men, attracted from every part of the world. The termination of the pilgrimage, he says, lends a very different aspect to the mosque. Illness and death, consequent upon the great fatigues undergone during the voyage, are accelerated by the scanty covering afforded by the ihram, the unhealthy dwellings of Mecca, the bad food, and frequent absolute dearth of provisions. The temple is filled with corpses brought thither to receive the prayers of the Imam, or with sick persons who insist upon being carried, as their last hours approach, to the colonnade, hoping to be saved by the sight of the Kaaba, or in any case to have the consolation of expiring within the sacred precincts. One sees poor pilgrims, sinking under illness and hunger, dragging their weary bodies along the colonnade, and when they no longer have the strength to stretch out a hand to the passerby, they place a little jar beside the mat upon which they are laid, to receive what charity may bestow upon them. As they feel the last moment approach, they cover themselves with their ragged clothes, and very often a day passes before it is ascertained that they are dead. We will conclude our extracts from Burckhardt's account of Mecca with his opinion of the inhabitants. Although the natives of Mecca possess grand qualities, although they are pleasant, hospitable, cheerful, and proud, they openly transgress the Quran by drinking, gambling, and smoking. Deceit and perjury are no longer looked upon as crimes by them. They do not ignore the scandal such vices bring upon them, but while each individually exclaims against the corruption of manners, none reform themselves. Upon the 15th of January, 1815, Burckhardt left Mecca with a caravan of pilgrims on their way to visit the tomb of the Prophet. The journey to Medina, like that between Mecca and Jeddah, was accomplished at night, and afforded little opportunity for observation. In the winter, night travelling is less comfortable than travelling by day. A valley called Wadi Fatmi, but generally known as El Wadi, was crossed. It abounded in shrubs and date trees, and was well cultivated in the eastern portion. A little beyond it lies the valley of Es Safra, the market of the neighbouring tribes, and celebrated for its plantations of dates. The traveller relates that the groves of date trees extend for nearly 4 miles, and belong to the natives of Es Safra as well as to the Bedouins of the neighbourhood, who employ labourers to water the ground, and come themselves to reap the harvest. The date trees pass from one person to another in the course of trade. They are sold separately. A father often receives 3 date trees as the price of the daughter he gives in marriage. They are all planted in deep sand brought from the middle of the valley, and piled up over their roots. They ought to be renewed every year, and they are generally swept away by the torrents. Each little plot is surrounded by a wall of mud or stone, and the cultivators live in hamlets or isolated cabins among the trees. The principal stream flows through a grove near the market. Beside it rises a little mosque, shaded by large chestnuts. I had seen none before in the Hejaz. Burckhardt was 13 days in reaching Medina, but this rather long journey was not lost time to him. He collected much information about the Arabs and the Wahhabis. At Medina, as at Mecca, the pilgrim's first duty is to visit the tomb and mosque of Mahomet, but the ceremonies attending the visit are much easier and shorter, and the traveller performed them in a quarter of an hour. Burckhardt's stay at Mecca had already been prejudicial to him. At Medina he was attacked by intermittent fever, which increased in violence and was accompanied by violent sickness. This soon so reduced him that he could no longer rise from his carpet without the assistance of his slave, a poor fellow who by nature and habit was more fit to tend camels than to take care of his worn-out and enfeebled master. Burckhardt being detained at Medina for more than 3 months by a fever, due to bad climate, the detestable quality of the water, and the prevalence of infectious illnesses, was forced to relinquish his project of crossing the desert to Aqaba in order to reach Yanibo as quickly as possible, and from thence embark for Egypt. Next to Aleppo, he says, Medina is the best-built town I have seen in the East. It is entirely of stone, the houses being generally 3 stories high with flat tops. As they are not whitewashed and the stone is brown in colour, the streets, which are very narrow, have usually a sombre appearance. They are often only 2 or 3 paces wide. At the present time Medina looks desolate enough. The houses are falling into ruins. Their owners, who formerly derived a considerable profit from the inroad of pilgrims, find their revenues diminishing, as the Wahhabis forbid visitors to the tomb of the Prophet, alleging that he was but a mere mortal. The possession which places Medina on a par with Mecca is the Grand Mosque, containing the tomb of Mahomet. This is smaller than that at Mecca, but is built upon the same plan, in a large square courtyard, surrounded on all sides by covered galleries, and having a small building in the centre. The famous tomb, surrounded by an iron railing painted green, is near the eastern corner. It is of good workmanship, in imitation of filigree, and interlaced with inscriptions in copper. 4 doors, of which 3 lead into this enclosure, are kept constantly shut. Permission to enter is freely accorded to persons of rank, and others can purchase permission of the principal eunuchs for about 15 piastres. In the interior are hangings which surround the tomb, and are only a few feet from it. According to the historian of Medina, these hangings cover a square edifice, built of black stones, and supported upon 2 columns, in the interior of which are the sepulchres of Mahomet and his 2 eldest disciples, Abu Bakr and Omar. He also states that these sepulchres are deep holes, and that the coffin which contains the ashes of Mahomet is covered with silver, and surmounted by a marble slab with the inscription, "In the name of God, give him thy pity. The fables which were spread throughout Europe as to the tomb of the prophet being suspended in mid-air are unknown in the Hejaz. The mosque was robbed of a great part of its treasures by the Wahhabis, but there is some ground for believing that they had been forestalled by the successive guardians of the tomb. Many other interesting details of Medina and its inhabitants, surroundings, and the haunts of pilgrims are to be found in Burckhardt's narrative, but we have given sufficient extracts to induce the reader who desires further information respecting the manners and customs of the Arabs, which have not changed, to refer to the book itself. Upon the 21st of April, 1815, Burckhardt joined a caravan which conducted him to Yembo, where the plague was raging. The traveller at once fell ill and became so weak that it was impossible for him to resort to a country place. To embark was equally impossible. All the vessels which were ready to start were crowded with soldiers. He was compelled to remain 18 days in the unhealthy little town before he could obtain a passage in a small vessel which took him to Qasr and thence to Egypt. Upon his return to Cairo, Burckhardt heard of his father's death. The traveller's constitution had been sorely tried by illness, and he was unable to attempt the ascent of Mount Sinai. The study of natural history, the publication of his diary, and his correspondence occupied him, at which time he expected to go with a caravan to Fezzan. Unfortunately, he succumbed to a sudden attack of fever, his last words being, "Write and tell my mother that my last thought was of her." Burckhardt was an accomplished traveller, well-informed, exact to minuteness, patient, courageous, and endowed with an upright and energetic character. His writings are of great value. The narrative of his voyage in Arabia, of which he unfortunately could not explore the interior, is so complete and precise that owing to it that country was then better known than many in Europe. In writing to his father from Cairo on the 13th of March, 1817, he says, "I have never said a word about what I have seen and met with that my conscience did not entirely justify. I did not expose myself to so much danger in order to write a romance." The explorers who have succeeded him in the same countries unanimously testify to his exactness and agree in praising his fidelity, knowledge, and sagacity. Few travellers, says the Revue Germanique, have enjoyed in a like degree the faculty of observation. That is a rare gift of nature. Like all eminent qualities, he possessed a sort of intuition which discerned the truth, apart from his own observations, and thus information given by him from hearsay has a value that seldom attaches to statements of that nature. His mind, early ripened by reflection and study, he was but in his 33rd year at the time of his death, invariably went straight to the point. His narrative, always sober, is filled, one may say, rather with things than words, yet his narratives possess infinite charm. One admires the man in them as much as the savant and observer. While the biblical countries occupied the attention of Seetzen and Burckhardt, India, the birthplace of most of the European languages, was about to command the attention of students of language, literature, and religion, as well as of geography. For the present our concern is with those problems of physical geography, which the conquests and studies of the India Company were about to solve by degrees. In a preceding volume, we have related how the Portuguese rule was established in India. The union of Portugal with Spain, in 1599, led to the fall of the Portuguese colonies, which came into the possession of the English and Dutch. England soon afterwards granted a monopoly of the commerce of India to a company which was destined to play an important part in history. At this time Akbar, the great Mughal emperor, the seventh descendant of Timur-Lenk, had established a vast empire in Hindustan and Bengal, upon the ruins of the Rajput kingdoms. Owing to the personal qualities of Akbar, which had gained for him the surname of the benefactor of man, that empire was at the height of its glory. The same brilliant course was pursued by Shah Jahan, but Akbar's grandson, Aurangzeb, inspired by an insatiable ambition, assassinated his brothers, imprisoned his father, and seized the reins of government. While the Mughal Empire was in the enjoyment of profound peace, a clever adventurer laid the foundations of the Maratha Empire. The religious intolerance of Aurangzeb and his crafty policy led to the insurrection of the Rajputs and a struggle, which by draining the resources of the empire, shook his power. The death of the great usurper was followed by the decadence of the empire. Up to this period, the India Company had been unable to add to the narrow strip of territory which they possessed at the ports, but it was now to benefit by the conflict between the Nabobs and Rajas of Hindustan. It was not, however, until after the taking of Madras in 1746 by La Bourdonnais and the struggle against Dupleix that the influence and dominion of the English company was materially increased. The crafty policy of Clive and Hastings, the English governors who successively employed force, stratagem, and bribery to attain their ends, laid the foundation of British greatness in India, and at the close of the last century, the company were possessors of an immense extent of country, with no less than 60 millions of inhabitants. Their territory included Bengal, Bihar, the provinces of Benares, Madras, and the Sircars. Tipu Saib alone, the Sultan of Mysore, struggled against the English encroachments, but he was unable to hold out against the coalition formed against him by the skill of Colonel Wellesley. When rid of their formidable enemies, the company overcame such opposition as remained by pensions, and under the pretext of protection, imposed upon the Rajas an English garrison which was maintained at their expense. One would imagine from all this that the English rule was detested, but that is not the case. The company, recognizing the rights of individuals, did not attempt to change the religion, laws, or customs of their subjects. Neither is it surprising that travellers, even when they ventured into districts which, properly speaking, did not belong to Great Britain, incurred but little danger. In fact, so soon as the East India Company was free from political embarrassments, it encouraged explorers throughout its vast domains. At the same time, travellers were dispatched to the neighbouring territories to collect observations, and we propose rapidly to review those expeditions. Map of English India and part of Persia. Grave par-e-Moriu. One of the first and most curious was that of Webb to the sources of the Ganges, a river concerning which uncertain and contradictory opinions prevailed. The government of Bengal, recognizing the great importance of the Ganges in the interests of commerce, organized an expedition, of which Messrs. Webb, Roper, and Hearsay formed part. They were to be accompanied by sepoys, native servants, and interpreters. The expedition reached Hurdwar, a small village on the left of the river, upon the 1st of April, 1808. The situation of this village at the entrance of the fertile plains of Hindustan had caused it to be much frequented by pilgrims, and it was at this spot that purifications in the waters of the holy river took place during the hot season. As every pilgrimage implies the sale of relics, Hurdwar was the centre of an important market, where horses, camels, antimony, asafoetida, dried fruits, shawls, arrows, muslins, cotton and woolen goods from the Punjab, Kabulistan, and Kashmir were to be had. Slaves, too, were to be bought there from 3 to 30 years of age, at prices varying to 150 rupees. This fair, where such different races, languages, and costumes were to be met with, presented a curious spectacle. Upon the 12th of April, the English expedition set out for Gangotri, following a road planted with white mulberries and figs, as far as Gurindar. A little farther on, watermills of simple construction were at work, upon the banks of streams shaded with willows and raspberry trees. The soil was fertile, but the tyranny of the government prevented the natives from making the best of it. The route soon became mountainous, but peach, apricot, nut, and other European trees abounded, and at length the expedition found themselves in the midst of a chain of mountains, which appeared to belong to the Himalaya range. The Bagharati, which is known further on as the Ganges, was met with at the end of a pass. To the left the river is bounded by high, almost barren mountains, to the right stretches a fertile valley. At the village of Teachayavli the poppy is largely cultivated for the preparation of opium. Here, owing probably to the bad quality of the water, all the peasants suffer from wens. At Jasvara the travellers had to cross a bridge of rope, called a jorilla. This was a strange and perilous structure. On either side of the river, says Webb, 2 strong poles are driven in at a distance of 2 feet from each other, and across them is placed another piece of wood. To this is attached a dozen or more thick ropes, which are held down upon the ground by large heaps of wood. They are divided into 2 packets about a foot apart. Below hangs a ladder of rope knotted to one of these, which answers instead of a parapet. The flooring of the bridge is composed of small branches of trees, placed at intervals of 2.5 or 3 feet from each other. As these are generally slender, they seem as if they were on the point of breaking every moment, which naturally induces the traveller to depend upon the support of the ropes which form the parapet, and to keep them constantly under their arms. The first step taken upon so shaky a structure is sufficient to cause giddiness, for the action of walking makes it swing to either side, and the noise of the torrent over which it is suspended is not reassuring. Moreover, the bridge is so narrow that if 2 persons meet upon it, one must draw completely to the side to make room for the other. Bridge of rope. Bridge of rope. The expedition afterwards passed through the town of Baharat, where but few of the houses have been rebuilt since the earthquake of 1803. This locality has always enjoyed a certain importance from the fact that a market is held there, and also on account of the difficulty of obtaining provisions in the towns higher up, as well as from its central position. The routes to Jamohi, Kedar, Nath and Srinagar all meet there. Beyond Bathery, the road became so bad that the travellers were obliged to abandon their baggage. There was a mere path track by the edge of precipices, amid debris of stones and rocks, and the attempt to proceed was soon relinquished. Devaprayaga is situated at the junction of the Bagharati and the Alaknanda. The first, coming from the north, hurries along with noise and impetuosity. The second, broader, deeper and more tranquil, rises no less than 46 feet above its ordinary level in the rainy season. The junction of these two rivers forms the Ganges, and is a sacred spot from which the Brahmins draw considerable profit, as they have arranged pools there, where for a certain price pilgrims can perform their ablutions without danger of being carried away by the current. The Alaknanda was crossed by means of a running bridge, or dindla, which is thus described. This bridge consists of 3 or 4 large ropes fixed upon either bank, and upon these a small seat, some 18 inches square, is slung by means of hoops at either end. Upon this seat the traveller takes his place, and is drawn from one side of the river to the other by a rope pulled by the man upon the opposite bank. The expedition reached Srinagar upon the 13th of May. The curiosity of the inhabitants had been so much excited that the magistrates sent a message to the English begging them to march through the town. Srinagar, which had been visited by Colonel Hardwicke in 1796, had been almost completely destroyed by the earthquake of 1803, and had in the same year been conquered by the Gorkhalis. Here Webb was joined by the emissaries whom he had sent to Gangotri by the route which he himself had been unable to follow, and who had visited the source of the Ganges. A large rock, he says, on either side of which water flows, and which is very shallow, roughly resembles the body and mouth of a cow. A cavity at one end of its surface gave rise to its name of Gayayumaki, the mouth of the cow, who, by its fancied resemblance, is popularly supposed to vomit the water of the sacred river. A little farther on, advance is impossible. A mountain as steep as a wall rises in front. The Ganges appeared to issue from the snow which lay at its feet. The valley terminated here. No one has ever gone any farther. The expedition returned by a different route. It met with the tributaries of the Ganges and of the Kelly Gunga or Mandakni rivers rising in the mountains of Kurdar. Immense flocks of goats and sheep laden with grain were met with, numbers of defiles crossed, and after passing the towns of Badrinath and Manna, the expedition finally reached the cascade of Barsan, in the midst of heavy snow and intense cold. This, says Webb's narrative, is the goal of the devotions of the pilgrims. Some of them come here to be sprinkled by the sacred spray of the cascade. At this spot, the course of the Alaknanda may be traced as far as the southwestern extremity of the valley, but its source is hidden under heaps of snow, which have probably been accumulating for centuries. Webb furnishes some details respecting the women of Manna. They wore necklaces, earrings, and gold and silver ornaments, which were scarcely in keeping with their coarse attire. Some of the children wore necklaces and bracelets of silver to the value of 600 rupees. In winter, this town, which does a great trade with Thibet, is completely buried in snow, and the natives take refuge in neighbouring towns. The expedition visited the temple at Badrinath, which is far famed for its sanctity. Neither its internal nor external structure or appearance give any idea of the immense sums which are expended upon it. It is one of the oldest and most venerated sanctuaries of India. Ablutions are performed there in reservoirs fed with very warm sulphureous water. There are, says the narrative, a great number of hot springs, each having their special name and virtue, and from all of them doubtless the Brahmins derive profit. For this reason the poor pilgrim, as he gets through the requisite ablutions, finds his purse diminish with the number of his sins, and the many tolls exacted from him upon the road to paradise might induce him to consider the narrow way by no means the least expensive one. This temple possesses 700 villages, which have either been ceded to it by government, given as security for loans, or bought by private individuals, and given as offerings. The expedition reached Jaisalmer on the 1st of June. There the Brahmin who acted as guide received orders from the government of Nepal to conduct the travellers back immediately to the territories of the company. The government had discovered, a little late it must be admitted, that the English explorations had a political as well as a geographical significance. A month afterwards, Webb and his companions entered Delhi, having definitely settled the course of the Ganges, and ascertained the sources of the Bagharati and Alaknanda, in fact, having attained the object which the company had had in view. In 1808, the English government decided upon sending a new mission to the Punjab, then under the dominion of Ranjit Singh. The anonymous narrative of this expedition, published in the Annals des Voyages, offers some particulars of interest, from which we will extract a few. Upon the 6th of April, 1808, an English officer in charge of the expedition reached Hurdnai, which he represents as the rendezvous of 1,000,000 individuals at the time of the yearly fair. At Boria, which is situated between the Jumna and the Sutlej, the traveller was an object of much curiosity to the women, who begged permission to come and see him. Their looks and gestures, says the narrative, sufficiently expressed their surprise. They approached me laughing heartily, the colour of my face amused them extremely. They addressed many questions to me, asking me whether I never wore a hat, whether I exposed my face to the sun, whether I remained continually shut up, or only walked out under shelter, and whether I slept upon the table placed in my tent, although my bed occupied one side of it. The curtains were, however, closed. They then examined it in detail, together with the lining of my tent, and everything belonging to it. These women were all good-looking, with mild and regular features. Their complexion was olive, and contrasted agreeably with their white and even teeth, which are a distinguishing feature of all the inhabitants of the Punjab. Mustafabad, Mulana and Umballa were visited in succession by the British officer. The country through which he passed was inhabited by Sikhs, a race remarkable for benevolence, hospitality and truthfulness. The author of the narrative is of opinion that they are the finest race of men in India. Puchala, Maikanara, Feganara, Audamita, which Lord Lake entered in 1805 in his pursuit of a Maratha chief, and finally Amritsar were stages easily passed. Amritsar is better built than the generality of towns in Hindustan. It is the largest depot of shawls and saffron as well as other articles of Deccan merchandise. The traveller says, "Upon the 14th, having put white shoes on my feet, I paid a visit to the Amritsar or reservoir of the elixir of immortality, from whence the city derives its name. It is a reservoir of about 135 feet square, built of brick, and in the centre is a pretty temple dedicated to Guru Govind Singh. A footpath leads to it. It is decorated both within and without, and the Raja often adds to its stores by gifts of ornaments. In this sacred receptacle, the Book of the Laws, written by Guran in the Guru Maukhati's character, is placed. This temple is called Hermandal, or the dwelling of God. Some 600 priests are attached to its service, and comfortable dwellings are provided for them out of the voluntary contributions of the devotees who visit the temple. Although the priests are regarded with infinite respect, they are not absolutely free from vice. When they have money, they spend it as freely as they have gained it. The number of pretty women who daily repair to the temple is very great. They far excel the women of the inferior classes in Hindustan in the elegance of their manners, their fine proportions, and handsome features." Lahore was next visited by the officer. It is interesting to know what remained of that fine city at the commencement of the present century. The narrative says, "Its very high walls are ornamented externally with all the profusion of Eastern taste, but they are falling into ruins, as are also the mosques and houses inside the town. Time has laid its destructive hand upon this city, as upon Delhi and Agra. The ruins of Lahore are already as extensive as those of that ancient capital." 3 days after his arrival, the traveller was received with great politeness by Ranjit Singh, who conversed with him, principally upon military topics. The Raja was then 27 years of age. His countenance would have been pleasant, had not the smallpox deprived him of one eye. His manners were simple, affable, and yet kingly. After paying visits to the tomb of Shah Jahan, to the Shalimar and other monuments at Lahore, the officer returned to Delhi and the possessions of the company. To his visit was due that better knowledge of the country which could not fail to tempt the ambition of the English government. The following year, 1809, an embassy consisting of Messrs. Nicholas Hankey Smith, Henry Ellis, Robert Taylor and Henry Pottinger was sent to the emirs of Sindh. The escort was commanded by Captain Charles Christie. The mission was transported to Karachi by boat. The governor of that fort refused to allow the embassy to disembark, without instructions from the emirs. An interchange of correspondence ensued, as a result of which the envoy, Smith, drew attention to certain improprieties relating to the title and respective rank of the Governor-General and the emirs. The governor excused himself upon the ground of his ignorance of the Persian language, and said that, not wishing a cause of misunderstanding to exist, he was quite ready to kill or put out the eyes, as the envoy pleased, of the person who had written the letter. This declaration appeared sufficient to the English, who deprecated the execution of the guilty person. In their letters, the emirs affected a tone of contemptuous superiority. At the same time, they brought a body of 8,000 men within reach, and put every possible difficulty in the way of the English efforts to procure information. After tedious negotiations, in the course of which British pride was humbled more than once, the embassy received permission to start for Hyderabad. Above Karachi, which is the principal export harbour of Sindh, a vast plain without trees or vegetation extends along the coast. 5 days are necessary to cross this, and reach Tata, the ancient capital of Sindh, then ruined and deserted. Formerly it was brought into communication by means of canals, with the Sindh, an immense river, which is at its mouth in reality an arm of the sea. Pottinger collected the most precise, complete and useful details respecting the Sindh, which were then known. It had been arranged beforehand that the embassy should find a plausible excuse for separating and reaching Hyderabad by 2 different routes. In order to obtain geographical information on the country, the city was soon reached, and the same difficult negotiations about the reception of the embassy, who refused to submit to the humiliating exactions of the emirs, had to be gone through. Pottinger thus describes the arrival at Hyderabad. The precipice upon which the eastern facade of the fortress of Hyderabad is situated, the roofs of the houses, and even the fortifications, were thronged by a multitude of both sexes, who testified friendly feeling towards us by acclamation and applause. Upon reaching the palace where they were to dismount, the English were met by Uli Muhammad Khan and other eminent officers, who walked before us towards a covered platform, at the extremity of which the emirs were seated. This platform being covered with the richest Persian carpet, we took off our shoes. From the moment the envoy took the first step towards the princes, they all 3 rose, and remained standing until he reached the place pointed out to him, an embroidered cloth, which distinguished him from the rest of the embassy. The princes addressed to each of us polite questions respecting our health. As it was a purely ceremonial reception, everything went off well, with compliments and polite expressions. The emirs wore a great number of precious stones, in addition to those which ornamented the hilts and scabbards of their swords and daggers, and emeralds and rubies of extraordinary size shone at their girdles. They were seated according to age, the eldest in the centre, the second to his right, the youngest on the left. A carpet of light felt covered the entire circle, and over this was a mattress of silk about an inch thick, exactly large enough to accommodate the 3 princes. They were seated according to age. The narrative concludes with a description of Hyderabad, a fortress which would have scarcely been able to offer any resistance to a European enemy, and with various reflections upon the nature of the embassy, which had amongst other aims the closing of the entrance of Sindh against the French. The treaty concluded, the English returned to Bombay. By this expedition, the East India Company gained a better knowledge of one of the neighbouring kingdoms, and collected precious documents relating to the resources and productions of a country traversed by an immense river, the Indus of the ancients, which rises in the Himalayas, and might readily serve to transport the products of an immense territory. The end gained was perhaps rather political than geographical, but science profited once more by political needs. Hitherto the little knowledge that had been gained of the regions lying between Kabulistan, India and Persia, had been as incomplete as it was defective. The company, thoroughly satisfied with the manner in which Captain Christie and Lieutenant Pottinger had accomplished their embassy, resolved to confide to them a delicate and difficult mission. They were to rejoin General Malcolm, ambassador to Persia, by crossing Baluchistan, and in so doing to collect more accurate and precise details of that vast extent of country than had hitherto been acquired. It was useless to think of crossing Baluchistan, with its fanatic population, in European dress. Christie and Pottinger therefore had recourse to a Hindu merchant, who provided horses on behalf of the governments of Madras and Bombay, and accredited them as his agents to Kelat, the capital of Baluchistan. Upon the 2nd of January 1810, the 2 officers embarked at Bombay for Samani, the sole seaport of the province of Lhasa, which they reached after a stay at Porbandar, on the coast of Gujarat. The entire country traversed by the travellers before they arrived at Bela was a morass, interspersed with jungle. The Jam, or governor of that town, was an intelligent man. He put numerous questions to the English, by which he showed a desire to learn, and then confided the task of conducting the travelers to Kelat, to the chief of the tribe of Bezenjos, who are Baluches. Baluchistan warriors. Baluchistan warriors. Facsimile of early engraving. The climate had changed since they left Bombay, and in the mountains, Pottinger and Christie experienced cold sufficiently keen to freeze the water in the leather bottles. Kelat, says Pottinger, the capital of the whole of Baluchistan, whence it derives its name Kelat or the city, is situated upon a height to the west of a well-cultivated plain or valley, 8 miles long and 3 wide. The greater portion of this is laid out in gardens. The town forms a square. It is surrounded on 3 sides by a mud wall about 20 feet high, flanked at distances of 250 feet, by bastions, which, like the walls, are pierced with a large number of barbicans for musketry. I had no opportunity of visiting the interior of the palace, but it consists merely of a confused mass of mud buildings with flat roofs like terraces. The whole is defended by low walls, furnished with parapets and pierced with barbicans. There are about 2,500 houses in the town, and nearly half as many in the suburbs. They are built of half-baked bricks and wood, the whole smeared over with mud. The streets, as a rule, are larger than those in towns inhabited by Asiatics. They usually have a raised footway on either side for pedestrians, in the center an open stream, which is rendered very unpleasant by the filth and rubbish thrown into it, and by the stagnant rainwater which collects, for there is no regulation insisting upon it being cleaned. Another obstacle to the cleanliness and comfort of the town exists in the projection of the upper stories of the houses, which makes the underbuildings damp and dark. The bazaar of Kelat is very large, and well stocked with every kind of merchandise. Every day it is supplied with provisions, vegetables, and all kinds of food, which are cheap. According to Pottinger's account, the population is divided into 2 distinct classes, the Baluches and the Brahuis, and each of these is subdivided into a number of tribes. The first is related to the modern Persian, both in appearance and speech. The Brahui, on the contrary, retains a great number of Hindu words. Intermarriage between the two has given rise to a third. The Baluches, coming from the mountains of Mekram, are Tunites, that is to say, they consider the first 4 imams as the legitimate successors of Mahomet. They are a pastoral people, and have the faults and virtues of their class. If they are hospitable, they are also indolent, and pass their time in gambling and smoking. As a rule, they content themselves with 1 or 2 wives, and are less jealous of their being seen by strangers than are other Mussulmen. They have a large number of slaves of both sexes whom they treat humanely. They are excellent marksmen, and passionately fond of hunting. Brave under all circumstances, they take pleasure in razzias, which they call tichepaus. As a rule, these expeditions are undertaken by the Enheroyuis, the wildest and most thievish of the Baluches. The Brahuis carry their wandering habits still farther. Few men are more active and strong. They endure the glacial cold of the mountains equally with the burning heat of the plains. They are of small stature, but as brave, as skillful in shooting, as faithful to their promises as the Baluches, and have not so pronounced a taste for plunder. Pottinger says, I have seen no Asiatic people whom they resemble, for a large number have brown hair and beards. After a short stay at Kelat, the 2 travelers who still passed as horse dealers resolved to continue their journey, but instead of following the high road to Kandahar, they crossed a dreary and barren country, ill-populated, watered by the Kaysar, a river which dries up during the summer, and they reached a little town called Noshki or Nauchki on the frontier of Afghanistan. At this place, the Baluches, who appeared friendly, represented to them the great difficulty of reaching Khorasan and its capital, Herat, by way of Sejistan. They advised the travelers to try to reach Kerman by way of Kedj and Bempa, or by Surd, a village on the western frontier of Baluchistan, and from thence to enter Nurmanchir. At the same moment, the idea of following 2 distinct routes presented itself to both Christie and Pottinger. This course was contrary to their instructions, but, said Pottinger, we found a ready excuse in the unquestionable advantage which would result from our procuring more extensive geographical and statistical knowledge of the country we were sent to explore than we could hope to do by travelling together. Christie set out first by way of Dushak. We shall follow his fortunes hereafter. A few days later, while still at Nauch, Pottinger received letters from his correspondent at Kelat, telling him that the emirs of Sind were searching for them, as they had been recognized, and that his best plan for safety was to set out immediately. Upon the 25th of March, Pottinger started for Sarowan, a very small town near the Afghan frontier. Upon his way thither Pottinger met with some singular altars, or tombs, the construction of which was attributed to the Ghebers, or fire worshippers, who are known in our day as Parsees. Serawan is 6 miles from the Serawani Mountains, in a sterile and bare district. This town owes its existence to the constant supply of water it derives from the Bali, an inestimable advantage in a country constantly exposed to drought, scarcity and famine. Pottinger afterwards visited the Kharan, celebrated for the strength and activity of its camels, and crossed the desert which forms the southern extremity of Afghanistan. The sand of this desert is so fine that its particles are almost impalpable, and the action of the wind causes it to accumulate into heaps 10 or 20 feet high, divided by deep valleys. Even in calm weather a great number of particles float in the air, giving rise to a mirage of a peculiar kind, and getting into the traveller's eyes, mouth and nostrils, cause an excessive irritation, with an insatiable thirst. In all this territory, Pottinger personated a Pirzadeh, or holy man, for the natives are of a very thievish disposition, and in the character of a merchant he might have been involved in unpleasant adventures. After leaving the village of Gaul in the district of Dazauk, the traveller passed through the ruined towns of Osmanabad, Hefter and Pora, where Pottinger was forced to admit that he was a Feringhi, to the great scandal of the guide, who during the 2 months they had been together had never doubted him, and to whom he had given many proofs of sanctity. At last, worn out by fatigue, and at the end of his resources, Pottinger reached Bemper, a locality which had been visited in 1808 by Mr. Grant, a captain in the Bengal sepoy infantry. Encouraged by the excellent account given by that officer, Pottinger presented himself to the Sirdar. But instead of affording him the necessary help for the prosecution of his journey, that functionary, discontented with the small present Pottinger offered him, found means to extort from him a pair of pistols, which would have been of great use to him. Basman is the last inhabited town of Baluchistan. At this spot there is a hot sulphureous spring, which the Baluchis consider a certain cure for cutaneous diseases. The frontiers of Persia are far from scientific, hence a large tract of country remains not neutral, but a subject of dispute, and is the scene of sanguinary contests. The little town of Regan in Nermanshire is very pretty. It is a fort, or rather a fortified village, surrounded by high walls in good repair, and furnished with bastions. Further on in Persia proper lies Ben, a town which was formerly of importance, as the ruins which surround it sufficiently prove. Here Pottinger was cordially received by the governor. On approaching, says Pottinger, he turned to one of his suite and asked where the Feringhi was. I was pointed out to him. Making me a sign to follow him, his fixed look at me, which took me in from head to foot, proclaimed his astonishment at my costume, which in truth was strange enough to serve as an excuse for the impoliteness of his staring. I was wearing the long shirt of a Baluchi, and a pair of trousers which had once been white, but which in the 6 weeks I had worn them had become brown, and were all but in rags. In addition to this I had on a blue turban, a piece of rope served me as a girdle, and I carried in my hand a thick stick, which had assisted me greatly in my walking and protected me from dogs. In spite of the dilapidated appearance of the tatterdemalion who thus presented himself before him, the governor received Pottinger with as much cordiality as was to be expected from a Mussulman, and provided him with a guide to Kerman. The traveller reached that town upon the 3rd of May, feeling that he had accomplished the most difficult portion of his journey, and was almost in safety. Kerman is the capital of ancient Karamania. Under the Afghan rule it was a flourishing town, and manufactured shawls which rivaled those of Kashmir. Here Pottinger witnessed one of those spectacles which, common enough to countries where human life is of little value, always fill Europeans with horror and disgust. The governor of this town was both son-in-law and nephew of the Shah, and also the son of the Shah's wife. Upon the 15th of May, says Pottinger, the prince himself judged certain persons who were accused of killing one of their servants. It is difficult to estimate the state of restlessness and alarm which prevailed in the village during the entire day. The gates of the town were shut, that no one might pass out. The government officials did not transact any business. People were cited as witnesses, without previous notice. I saw 2 or 3 taken to the palace in a state of agitation which could scarcely have been greater had they been going to the scaffold. About 3 in the afternoon the prince passed sentence upon those who had been convicted. Some had their eyes put out, some the tongue split, some had the ears, nose and lips cut off, others were deprived of their hands, fingers or toes. I learned that whilst these horrible punishments were inflicted, the prince remained seated at the window where I had seen him, and gave his orders without the least sign of compassion or of horror at the scene which took place before him. Leaving Kerman, Pottinger reached Chir Babig, which is equally distant from Yezd, Shiraz and Kerman, and thence proceeded to Ispahan, where he had the pleasure of finding his companion Christie. At Meragha he met General Malcolm. It was now 7 months since they had left Bombay. Christie had traversed miles, and Pottinger 2412. Meanwhile Christie had accomplished his perilous journey much better than he had anticipated. Leaving Nouch upon the 22nd of March, he crossed the Vachouty Mountains and some uncultivated country to the banks of the Helmend, a river which flows into Lake Hamon.